Let's make a couple of things clear at the start. One is I'm from England, and secondly, I'm an educational psychologist, so that my perspective is different from Gary's, and it's different from the ones that we've been listening to so far, because it's the perspective of an outsider who's familiar with a different system and is able to recognise some commonalities and some differences, which I'll come to. But why am I interested in this area? Because I was educated in an inner city disadvantaged area within Nottingham. And having gone on to university, what struck me was that all the young people far abler than myself in that secondary modern school who didn't get the chance to go to university. For me, it was a mistake of the system or a freak opportunity or whatever. It was the impact of one or two good teachers. But when I reflected on all the people who were educated in my year, the 100 or so, who ended up doing jobs which were less demanding and didn't have the educational opportunities, it stuck with me what made the difference. And what made the difference was teachers. So I trained as an educational psychologist in order to try and make a difference working with teachers, especially working with disadvantaged inner city kids. And what shocked me when I started this job was that I had been trained into using all sorts of tests to identify children who scored low on IQ scores in order to divert them out of the educational system, away from any form of education. And the English system of special education has a rich history. Some trace it back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we became factoryized, and there was a massive movement from the agrarian farming tradition into the inner city areas and into the factories. Those who couldn't function well in the factories because of their lack of motivation, lack of ability, lack of will, were cast out, and parishes cared for them in organisations called workhouses, where they were looked after. But people had to work for their living, and tasks, often farming tasks again, or simple manufacturing tasks, were there. Families were split up. Men and women did not sleep in the same part of the workhouse. Residential, they could not go out. And the children were also assigned simple tasks to earn their living. When they earned sufficient money and found a job, they could move out. And the aim was they should move out within a year or so. But there were some people who could not function well within a workhouse through significant physical disabilities, or the slowness or inability to learn the tasks required of them, or lacking the social skills to relate to the other people there. And since they couldn't be productive, they were ejected, excluded from the workhouse and sent to asylums, where it was literally an asylum. They were said to be looked after. They didn't have to work for their keep. They kept it. So the asylums were full of people with learning difficulties, physical disabilities, emotional, behavioural disorders, and whatever. And were looked after by medical officers who carried out simple tests to determine whether they were, able or not. One of the subjective assessments that was used on some of the documentation in use until the 1890s was the question, can you tell me the difference between a kipper, a herring and a bloater? And if you couldn't, then that was one of the criteria which deemed that you were mentally incapable of learning. For those of you who are listening to this, if anybody indeed is, I would have to point out that kippers, bloaters and herrings were far more frequent in the 1890s than they are now. So it was perhaps a slightly fair question. But that was the origins of special education and special testing. And there's a guy called Binet in Paris who had the job in the 1919s or so to identify young students in France who had learning difficulties. And I'll come back to Binet in a moment. And I'll also introduce my role as a psychologist. Psychologists, like many other people, were critical of the criteria used to assess, the example we heard, and so developed a series of tests. Binet was one, a guy called Cyril Burt another, and David Wexler in the States, perhaps created, devised the best known, even most notorious of the psychometric tests. And so that was the training. And the training of an educational psychologist in Britain, for most of the last century, was to identify young people at different crossroads and direct them, by and large, out of the mainstream. So based on your IQ, you might, if you had an IQ of less than 50, you were deemed to be ineducable. And so you were sent out of the educational system entirely. Because you weren't educable, there was no point in educating you. So you went to junior training centres. For youngsters with IQs of 50 to 75, they were educationally subnormal. Educationally subnormal. So their subnormality, it's a very nice phrase actually, their subnormality only started when they started schooling. Before they were 5, they weren't educationally subnormal. They were kids. When they became 5 and were seen by a psychologist or a school medical officer, they were educationally subnormal. When I started work as an educational psychologist in 1964, there were a series of day residential special schools. Quite close to where I worked, there was a place called an epileptic colony, where children who had seizures were removed from their parents and placed in some form of medical setting, because it was felt that it would disturb the learning of the others. There were many residential schools, often originally devised by benefactors, with the aim of providing some form of education, but often care for kids with disabilities. And it seemed to be that the more significant your care, the less you needed the love of your parents, because they were invariably residential. And so by the time the Second World War started, probably 5% or so of the school population in the city where I now work was in some form of special provision outside mainstream. And to cap that, when the war started, we then evacuated the children from the care of their parents, except one group, and that was the group who were in the special schools. Other kids were moved away for a place of safekeeping. My own brothers and sisters were so. But children with learning difficulties or special needs, they were kept within the city. They got the better deal in that sense. When I came to start work in 1964, then I was, for the first time in my life, I was working in special schools. And I was struck by the obscenity of lumping kids together for no other reason that they shared a common difficulty. And it seemed abhorrent to go into schools where you only mixed with people who had the same sort of construed disabilities that you were felt to have. And we were told that this was for the kids' own benefit, and that's the way it was. But even then, the research was coming through that there was no evidence of gains or benefits for kids attending special schools. And when I'm asked the question, does inclusion work? What are the benefits of it? It presumes the answer that children do benefit by going to special education. And in the 25, 30 years since that time, I've still looked, and I have yet to come across the evidence that demonstrates the educational advantages of special as opposed to mainstream ed. But that has been well known and apparently forgotten. In the late 80s and early 90s, similar views were being expressed in my own school board in Nottingham, and there was a major move towards moving children out of the more restrictive settings of special schools, and we started with looking at the costings of our current system. It was a funding-led change, although the values behind it and underlying it were child-focused. So we had a number of innovative deep-thinking people who came and provided a system called Children First, which summed up our aim to put the children first and to bring the kids back from educational segregation and into mainstream. And there's been a general stream towards doing this. We have yet to achieve it because it was driven by economies, and it was in the context of a rich tradition of special segregation. But there have been remarkable changes. The late 1980s and early 1990s, I became aware of some crazy things happening in Canada and seeing one or two pieces of video that had on a technique called Circles of Friends by an educational consultant called Marcia Forrest, working from the Centre for Inclusive Education and Community. I managed to get the address and turned up and knocked on the door. My first shock was not finding the institution, because I walked up and down Term Crescent many times looking for this impressive building until I found Jack and Marcia's home. And that was interesting because the concept of work being within your home and the two not being segregated or separate, I thought had a lot of power to it. And at the same time, I was introduced to Hamilton and had the chance to meet on that occasion Phil DeFrancesco, who courteously met me, described the system, took me over the road to a local primary school who were not expecting us, and let me loose with some of the teachers, took me to lunch, for which I have yet to pay him, and in the afternoon put on a grainy black and white film showing a rather slim, tall, white-haired guy talking about the system. Now that got my interest going, because I never expected to see inclusion in my lifetime. Never mind my professional lifetime. It was something, a goal, it was an aim, it was an ambition. So I arranged with Phil, who kindly allowed me to go back the following year and spend a week looking in schools, working in 2 different schools. This time I was ready for them. I was well prepared. So I had a much more rigorous examination of the teachers. So at the end of each day, when the kids had gone and various others had gone, I would sit in the staff room with the staff saying, okay, the principal's gone, the superintendents aren't around, let's cover coffee time, feet on the stool time, let's have a talk about where do these kids really go? Because they've got them locked away somewhere. It could be in a hospital setting, it could be in a social services setting, but somewhere, where are they? And I was shocked by the astonishment on teachers' faces that they were saying. I was meeting teachers who had been teaching for generations and had never been inside a special school, didn't know what one was, and were looking on what they were doing as normal. And the most staggering thing I learned from that week was that how incredibly, unimaginably normal and ordinary it all was. Schools were schools. The class sizes were similar to the ones that I had met. There was no big spotlight and a roll of drums following a couple of kids around and saying, hey, there's the included kid. There was none of that. In fact, in some places, you had to look hard, very hard, to see the kid who had some significant functional problem. The thing that did strike me, the major area of difference between what I've been used to, was the communities in the classroom and the building of friendships around children with disability. On an informal as well as formal level, I went into one lesson in a high school, and there was a young man at the front who was deeply disturbed by my presence. Deeply disturbed by my presence. I was at the back, and he was turning around and shouting and couldn't control himself. In the UK, when I go into classrooms and that happens, I'm sure it's not me all the time, but what happens then is, it is the job of the class teacher to calm or control the kid down, and if he can't do that, then exclude the kid from the classroom for a while. What shook me was the passiveness of the class teacher, or the subject teacher in the secondary school. He almost stood back. The rest of the class did it. Other kids saying, hang on to him, just calm down, he's just a guy, he's just coming, it's going to come. You're not normally like this, just calm down. I was shocked and impressed by the way the kids took that on. I saw wonderful examples by a teacher doing some reciprocal teaching with two kids with significant learning disabilities, where they shared roles, and the kids became the teacher to the teacher and the other child with a disability, and they swapped it in threes. Fairly ordinary. I went into I sat in on a maths lesson where there was an overall maths set of questions going to the class as a whole, while somebody else was signing with another child doing some maths which linked with it but was rather differently presented. I had a long conversation with the person who was in charge of special needs, and my first question to her being, how many additional resources you get to fix all this? And she gave me a withering look and said, the more we've learned about including children, the less resources we need, which put me in my place there. And I was pushing them hard and saying, well, at what point would kids not be allowed in? And they said, well, the special needs coordinator in our school, she brings them in out of hospital on stretchers. You know, if they've had an injury, if they're not here, they're in. I could not find anything within the seam which suggested anything differently. I have still keep the memory of talking with one student. Forgive me, I'm not sure of the gradings in Canada, but it would be grade 11 or 12 in the UK, sort of age 18 or so. And a student who was tutoring a young boy with Down syndrome, aged 11. And as part of the tutoring program, the school had arranged for her a peer tutoring program which led to a qualification, which was half a credit for going to university. And it was something like 30 hours teaching or preparation or study for her, something like 70 or so hours working with a young person and keeping a log and reviewing that. And I asked her what she'd learned from working with this young boy. And she said, well, his speech is not very clear, so he's taught me to listen harder. And I've also learned that if I listen harder, what he says makes sense. And I've also learned that sometimes you have to listen behind the words to understand what he says. This morning he said he wanted a glass of water. I don't think he wanted a glass of water. I think he was bored with what I was doing. And fourthly, he's taught me that if I present something to him in one way, he may not understand it. I might have to experiment with several ways of presenting it to him before he can get it. And that's been really helpful for myself, because I wanted to go to university and read physics, and I find part of physics very difficult to learn. It had never occurred to me before that I might try different ways in experimenting myself in order to get the physics. Who benefited? The young boy or the girl student? I could recount many other similar examples of this, but I'm of a generation that seeing is believing. I also read and write and study, but seeing is believing. So my experience of it convinced me that, yes, it is possible, and it's ordinary, but it's extraordinary what is achieved by it. And I think what we've seen from the video this morning of the comments and the descriptions and the accounts of Jim and Phil is that it's about being human. It's about making the school a community. It's about education not being about buildings but about learning. It's about learning being an essential part of our growing and being. And how do we stop ourselves and our administrators and our politicians, how do we prevent them from getting in the way of that and allowing kids to develop and grow?